This story is titled, I discovered my new wife's daughter only loved me for my inheritance, and her biological father was behind the scheme, so I cut all ties and only saw them again in the courtroom with my lawyers. Sup Reddit, my name is Marcus, and I'm 42 years old. For most of my adult life, I've been living what people would consider the perfect existence. From the outside looking in, everything appears flawless, like one of those carefully curated social media posts that makes everyone else feel inadequate about their own lives. I made the move to Miami several years ago, and I can honestly say I've never once regretted that decision. There's something about the eternal sunshine and pristine ocean beaches that perfectly complements my lifestyle. The weather is consistently beautiful, the energy is vibrant, and it's exactly the kind of place where I can thrive both personally and professionally. My career as a project manager for a major construction firm has been incredibly rewarding. I'm making good money, more than enough to live comfortably without having to make sacrifices on the things I truly enjoy. This financial success has allowed me to establish myself in a prestigious area of the city, drive an expensive car, and generally live without having to compromise on any of the pleasures or comforts that matter to me. But here's what really defines my life, and what makes everything else meaningful. I've been raising my stepdaughter Victoria since she was just 4 years old. Her biological father, Robert, completely disappeared from the picture before her second birthday. No phone calls, no financial support, no visits, absolutely nothing. He simply vanished as if she had never existed, leaving behind a little girl who would grow up without knowing her father. When I married Victoria's mother, Diana, Victoria was 6 years old. From that moment forward, I made the conscious decision to step into the role that Robert had abandoned. This wasn't because I felt obligated or because it was expected of me. I did it because I genuinely loved Diana, and honestly, as time went on, I grew to love Victoria just as deeply as if she were my own biological daughter. I was there for everything that mattered in her young life. I spent countless evenings helping her work through multiplication tables when math seemed impossible. I was the one who helped her learn to ride her first bike, running alongside her until she found her balance. When she had to have her appendix removed and spent a frightening night in the hospital, I was the one who stayed awake in that uncomfortable chair beside her bed, making sure she knew she wasn't alone. The beautiful thing about our relationship was that Victoria never felt pressured to call me Dad. But as the years passed and our bond grew stronger, she chose to use that title on her own. When she first said it, I felt something shift inside me, a profound sense of pride and belonging that I'll never forget. That simple word meant the world to me because it represented her genuine acceptance of me as her father figure. As the years continued to pass, our family found its rhythm, and Robert gradually faded from our conversations entirely. Victoria stopped waiting by the window on weekends, hoping he might show up unexpectedly. Diana and I were able to build our own little family unit, the kind that I felt genuinely proud to be part of. It was solid, loving, and real, in ways that I had always hoped for but never quite experienced before. The trust between Victoria and me grew into something incredibly solid and meaningful over the years. Through all the typical challenges of growing up, scraped knees that needed bandaging, teenage heartbreaks that required patient listening, school dances where I proudly took photos, I was consistently the dad standing by her side. I watched with fierce pride as she developed into an intelligent, capable young woman with her own ambitions and dreams. I made it a priority to teach Victoria important values like responsibility and integrity. These weren't just abstract concepts to me. They were principles that I tried to model in my daily life and work. As she grew older and showed genuine interest in the construction business, I began mentoring her more seriously. I poured years of experience and knowledge into training her, teaching her everything from basic project management to complex financial planning. This wasn't just because I hoped she might inherit the business someday, though that was certainly part of it, but because she demonstrated a genuine love for the work that mirrored my own passion. Our relationship wasn't perfect, and I don't want to paint it as some kind of fairy tale. We argued sometimes, disagreed on important matters, and occasionally drove each other absolutely crazy in the way that only family members can. But underneath all of that normal friction, there was something honest and unbreakable between us. At least, that's what I believed at the time. Our bond felt genuine and tested by years of shared experiences, mutual respect, and unconditional love. Then, just a few months ago, everything began to change in ways I never could have anticipated. Victoria and her husband Ryan were over for dinner one evening. The meal had been quiet and cozy, filled with the comfortable conversation that comes from people who know each other well and enjoy spending time together. We were discussing everyday topics, work, plans for the weekend, small updates about mutual friends, when Victoria suddenly dropped what felt like a grenade right into the middle of our peaceful evening. She said it casually without even looking up from her plate. "Oh, by the way, Robert messaged me." The reaction was immediate and visceral. Diana nearly choked on her food, coughing sharply into her napkin as she tried to process what she had just heard. My heart started pounding instantly, and I could feel every muscle in my body tightening as if I had suddenly sensed a serious threat in my own home. The comfortable atmosphere we had been enjoying just moments before completely evaporated. Robert, the same man who had completely ghosted his daughter when she was just a toddler, was now casually strolling back into our lives through social media as if nothing had ever happened. I turned to look directly at Victoria, trying to keep my voice steady despite the alarm bells going off in my head. "You didn't think that was worth mentioning before now?" I asked, unable to hide my concern. Victoria immediately became defensive, her tone suggesting she had already prepared for this conversation. "He just wanted to apologize for leaving," she said, as if that simple explanation should somehow make everything okay. Then she added something that made my stomach drop even further. "Apparently, he's been following my life for a while. He just didn't want to interfere." She used air quotes around the word interfere, and I could tell she was already beginning to defend him in her mind. I felt a surge of anger and disbelief. "Apologies come easy when all the hard work is already done," I said, perhaps with more edge in my voice than I intended. But I knew exactly what Robert was doing. I could see right through his sudden reappearance. He was sniffing around now because Victoria was successful, settled, and stable. People like Robert always have a sixth sense for when there might be something to gain, and they inevitably circle back when the timing benefits them most. This led to a brief but tense argument right there at the dinner table. Victoria insisted that she had everything under control and that we were overreacting to what she saw as a harmless reconnection. "I'm just talking to him, that's it," she promised, looking between Diana and me with an expression that suggested we were being unreasonable. But neither Diana nor I believed her reassurances. We both knew that Robert's sudden interest in rebuilding a relationship wasn't motivated by genuine remorse or paternal love. Despite our concerns, we ultimately had to let the matter go. Victoria was an adult, married, and fully capable of making her own decisions. We couldn't force her to cut off contact, no matter how much we wanted to protect her from what we suspected was coming. But that night, something fundamental shifted in our household. We didn't realize at the time just how significant that change would be, or how much damage Robert's return would ultimately cause. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if I missed important signs along the way. Victoria had always been someone who pushed herself harder than necessary, as if she constantly felt like she had something to prove. Maybe deep down, she never really felt like she truly belonged in our family, despite all the love and support we had given her. Perhaps Robert's sudden reappearance offered her a fantasy that she wasn't willing to let go of. The chance to finally have a relationship with her biological father and to feel complete in a way she had never experienced before. Things remained relatively quiet for the next few weeks, though there was an underlying tension that none of us could quite shake. Diana and I tried to go about our normal routines, but we both found ourselves watching Victoria more carefully, looking for signs of changes in her behavior or mood. We were walking on eggshells, unsure of what Robert might be planning or how his influence might be affecting our daughter. Then, one Saturday, Ryan came by the house alone to borrow some tools for a home improvement project. We chatted casually for a few minutes about work and weekend plans, the kind of comfortable small talk that had become natural between us over the years. Ryan had always been a good match for Victoria, and Diana and I had grown genuinely fond of him as a son-in-law. He was reliable, kind, and clearly devoted to making Victoria happy. But then, in the middle of our conversation, he accidentally let slip something that hit me like a physical blow. He mentioned that Victoria had been especially tired lately because of the baby. Diana froze completely, and I found myself staring at Ryan in complete shock. "She's pregnant?" I asked, unable to hide my disbelief. The moment the words left my mouth, I watched Ryan's face transform as panic flooded his features. "Oh man, you didn't know," he said, his eyes widening with guilt and embarrassment as he realized he had accidentally exposed Victoria's deliberate secrecy. The poor guy looked absolutely mortified, clearly understanding that he had just revealed something that Victoria had intentionally kept from us. A sharp, painful sensation twisted in my chest as the full implications of this hit me. This wasn't a case of forgetfulness or Victoria simply being overwhelmed with the news. She had made a conscious, deliberate choice to keep us completely in the dark about one of the most significant events in her life. I could immediately sense Robert's influence behind this decision. His fingerprints were all over this situation. He was already working to pull strings and cut us out of Victoria's life piece by piece, and this was just the beginning. The hurt I felt was profound and deeply personal. Here was our daughter, carrying our first grandchild, and she had deliberately chosen not to share this incredible news with the people who had raised her and loved her unconditionally for decades. Something felt fundamentally wrong about the entire situation, and I knew that Robert was somehow orchestrating this distance between us. Later that evening, Victoria finally called us. Her voice sounded distant and awkward, completely unlike the warm, familiar tone we were used to hearing from her. She confirmed the pregnancy with what felt like reluctant obligation rather than excited joy. When we tried to express our happiness and ask questions about how she was feeling, she claimed that she had meant to tell us but had been feeling overwhelmed by everything. But her explanation felt hollow and rehearsed. Her voice carried a detached quality that made it seem like she was speaking to strangers rather than to the parents who had been there for every important moment of her life. The conversation was stilted and uncomfortable, ending much sooner than any of us would have liked under normal circumstances. When we finally saw Victoria in person a few weeks later, the changes in her demeanor were impossible to ignore. She was 8 months along at that point, clearly showing and glowing with the natural beauty that often comes with pregnancy. On the surface, she seemed to be smiling and joking like her old self. But there was an unmistakable distance in her interactions with us. Nothing felt quite like it had before Robert's reappearance in her life. The most telling thing was that Robert's name never came up in our conversations, yet his shadow seemed to loom over every interaction we had. It was as if he was an invisible presence in the room, influencing Victoria's responses and creating barriers between us that had never existed before. The easy, natural flow of communication that had characterized our relationship for so many years was simply gone. Around this same time, Robert began appearing more frequently and prominently in Victoria's daily life. One of the most painful developments was when he convinced her to name the baby Robert Jr. When Diana and I learned about this decision, it felt like a devastating gut punch, as if Robert was deliberately marking his territory and asserting his dominance over our family relationships. Diana actually cried when she found out. And while I tried to maintain my composure and keep it together for everyone's sake, the hurt was absolutely real and profound. But Robert's manipulation didn't stop there. He began making private, subtle threats that revealed his true intentions. He hinted to me that if he wasn't welcomed warmly into our family circle, he would seriously consider pursuing legal action to establish formal visitation rights for his future grandchild. The implied threat felt like pure blackmail, and the audacity of it was almost laughable. Here was a man who had completely disappeared for 22 years, acting as if that abandonment could simply be erased by his sudden return. It wasn't just arrogant. It was a dangerous kind of arrogance that could still cause real damage to our family, regardless of how baseless his legal claims might be. Even empty threats can create chaos and expense, and Robert seemed to understand exactly how to use fear and uncertainty as weapons against us. Ryan also began confiding in me about the pressure he was experiencing. Robert had started approaching him privately, suggesting that Ryan's lack of enthusiastic support for Victoria's renewed relationship with her biological father might actually jeopardize Ryan's marriage. The manipulation was insidious and calculated. Robert was quietly working to turn everyone against each other while positioning himself as the reasonable party who just wanted to be part of his daughter's life. "I'm stuck, Marcus," Ryan whispered to me during one of our private conversations, his face showing visible strain and exhaustion. "If I fight too hard against this, she'll walk away from me. But if I say nothing and just go along with it, she'll end up destroying everything you've built." His desperation mirrored exactly what I was feeling, and I could see that Robert had carefully engineered this impossible situation for all of us. Robert was systematically manipulating everyone in Victoria's orbit, but Victoria herself either couldn't see what was happening or was unwilling to acknowledge it. We were all being gradually pushed out of our own family by the ghost of a man who had never earned any place in our lives to begin with. The weeks leading up to Victoria's due date felt increasingly tense and emotionally draining for everyone involved. Every conversation we had with Victoria felt forced and unnatural, as if we were all reading from scripts rather than speaking from the heart. Every interaction was shadowed by Robert's invisible but powerful presence, and Diana and I found ourselves feeling more and more like outsiders in the very family we had worked so hard to build and nurture over the years. What should have been one of the most joyful and anticipatory periods of our lives, waiting for the arrival of our first grandchild, was instead overshadowed by uncertainty, dread, and a growing sense of loss. The excitement that should have come naturally was tainted by the knowledge that Robert was systematically working to position himself as the primary grandfather figure, despite having contributed absolutely nothing to Victoria's upbringing or development. Ryan's situation became increasingly difficult during this time as well. He grew more withdrawn with each passing week, and it was obvious that he was under tremendous stress trying to navigate the emotional minefield that Robert had created within his own marriage. He admitted to me privately that he felt like he was constantly walking on eggshells around Victoria, terrified that any disagreement or expression of concern might be the thing that finally broke their already fragile peace. "I feel like I'm losing her," Ryan confessed to me one afternoon, the exhaustion and worry clear in his voice. "Every time I try to talk to her about what's happening, she gets defensive and starts quoting things that Robert has told her. It's like she's not even thinking for herself anymore." I wanted desperately to offer him some kind of support or guidance, but the truth was that I felt just as powerless and confused as he did. Robert had created a situation where any attempt to reason with Victoria was perceived as an attack on her newfound relationship with her biological father. Finally, the day arrived when Victoria went into labor. Diana and I waited anxiously at home, expecting that we would receive a call to rush to the hospital as soon as possible so we could be there to support Victoria and welcome our grandchild into the world. This was supposed to be one of the most important and meaningful days of our lives, and we had been looking forward to it for months, despite all the surrounding drama. But hours passed without a single word from Victoria or Ryan. Our anxiety continued to grow as we realized that something was very wrong with this picture. When the phone finally did ring, we learned that the baby had already arrived. We had missed the entire birth. Diana cried softly during the drive to the hospital, hurt that we hadn't been included in such a monumentally important moment in our family's history. Walking into that hospital room, Diana and I both froze at the sight that greeted us. There was Robert, sitting comfortably beside Victoria's bed as if he belonged there, cradling my grandson as though he had somehow earned that right through 22 years of absence and abandonment. My fist clenched involuntarily as anger and resentment flooded through me at the audacity of the scene before us. Robert's eyes met mine with a smugness that I recognized immediately. The look of someone who believed they had just won a significant victory. "Long time no see, Marcus," he drawled with casual arrogance, as if we were old friends meeting for coffee rather than two men with a complicated and painful history. I forced my voice to remain steady despite the rage building inside me. "You're holding my grandson," I said, making it clear that I didn't appreciate his presumptuous behavior. Robert raised an eyebrow, his smile turning cold and calculated. "Our grandson," he corrected me with emphasis, as if he had any legitimate claim to that title after decades of complete absence. Victoria lay in the hospital bed looking exhausted, but genuinely glowing with the natural joy that comes after childbirth. She seemed completely oblivious to the obvious tension filling the room, or perhaps she was choosing to ignore it. She introduced the baby to us cheerfully, acting as though nothing unusual or inappropriate had happened. The whole scene felt surreal and deeply wrong. Diana held the baby briefly, and I could see her joy mixing painfully with profound sorrow as she looked down at our grandson. What should have been a pure moment of happiness felt stolen and corrupted by Robert's calculated presence. He had deliberately positioned himself to be the first person to hold the baby, the first to establish that grandfather connection. And it was obvious that this had been planned well in advance. As Diana cooed softly to our grandson, Robert pulled me aside under the pretense of having a friendly, casual conversation. But the moment we were out of earshot from the others, his mask dropped completely. He leaned in close, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper that only I could hear. "Look, Marcus, I know you don't like me, but I'm here to stay," he began with false politeness that didn't hide the menace in his tone. "If you try to push me out, I'll make things very complicated for everyone involved. Grandparents have rights, you know." Then he paused, letting that threat sink in before delivering what he clearly considered his knockout punch. "See this, Marcus? It's about time I got my family back. Took long enough." He smirked with pure arrogance, his eyes gleaming with a sense of victory that he absolutely didn't deserve. But he wasn't finished. "You did a decent job stepping in when I wasn't around," he continued condescendingly. "But blood is thicker than water, right?" His threat hung in the air, clear and unmistakable. He was essentially telling me that my 20-plus years of being a father to Victoria meant nothing compared to his biological connection to her. Anger surged through me like a tidal wave, but I knew I couldn't give Robert the satisfaction of seeing that he had successfully rattled me. I kept my expression completely neutral and simply stared him down until he was forced to step back. both of us pretending that our exchange had been nothing more than casual banter between family members. Ryan stood in the corner of the room, clearly uncomfortable with everything that was happening. When our eyes met across the room, I saw the same helplessness and frustration reflected in his face that I was feeling. He nodded slightly, an unspoken acknowledgement of our shared discomfort and understanding of the impossible situation Robert had created for all of us. Diana gently returned the baby to Victoria after a few precious moments, and we excused ourselves from the hospital room shortly afterward. We claimed that we didn't want to overwhelm Victoria during her recovery, but the truth was that Robert's presence had made the entire experience unbearable. What should have been one of the most meaningful and joyful moments of our lives had been completely tainted by his calculated manipulation and territorial behavior. The drive home was conducted in complete silence, with both Diana and I lost in our own thoughts and struggling to process what had just happened. Diana quietly wept during the entire journey, mourning the beautiful moment we had envisioned and anticipated for months. A moment that was now forever tarnished by Robert's toxic presence. We had dreamed of being there for Victoria during labor, of being among the first to welcome our grandchild, and of sharing in the pure joy of new life. Instead, we felt like unwelcome intruders in our own family's most important moments. That night I lay awake for hours, replaying Robert's threatening words over and over in my mind. I felt completely helpless and consumed by anger, watching the family I had fought so hard to build, slowly slipping away from me piece by piece. I had no idea how to stop what was happening, and the sense of powerlessness was almost overwhelming. Everything I had worked for, all the love I had invested, all the years of being a devoted father, it all seemed to be crumbling under the weight of Robert's calculated return. After that devastating hospital experience, things only continued to deteriorate. Robert didn't fade away after making his threats, as I had desperately hoped he might. Instead, he became even more prominent and embedded himself deeper into Victoria's everyday life. His influence over her decisions and perspectives grew stronger with each passing day, and it became increasingly clear that he had a long-term strategy for pushing the rest of us out. Victoria began regularly skipping out on family dinners and gatherings that had been important traditions for our family for years. She always had excuses, claiming exhaustion from new motherhood or citing various business obligations as reasons why she couldn't join us. Each excuse felt hollow and rehearsed, but Diana and I tried desperately to accept them at face value. We were terrified of pushing her further away by challenging her obviously false explanations. Our construction company, which was something I had built specifically with Victoria's future in mind, started to suffer serious consequences from her sudden detachment. Victoria had always been deeply involved in the business operations and had been passionate about eventually taking over full control one day. She understood the industry, had great relationships with our clients, and genuinely loved the work. Now, however, she hardly showed up to the office anymore. She began missing important meetings with potential clients, leaving critical tasks unfinished, and generally behaving as if the business that was meant to be her inheritance no longer mattered to her. When I tried to gently confront her about these professional responsibilities, she would brush off my concerns casually and dismissively. She claimed that motherhood was her only priority now and that everything else would have to take a back seat. While I understood that having a new baby would naturally require adjustments to her schedule, her complete detachment from something she had once been so passionate about felt deliberate and painful. One evening, after a particularly difficult and frustrating day at work, dealing with the fallout from Victoria's absence, my phone rang. I saw Victoria's name on the caller ID and answered hopefully, thinking that maybe she was ready to have a real conversation about what was happening. But the moment I heard her voice, I knew this wasn't going to be the reconciliation I had been hoping for. Her voice was blunt and completely devoid of the warmth I had grown accustomed to over the years. "I've decided to sell my shares, Marcus," she announced without any preamble or explanation. "Robert wants to invest in the company, and I think he deserves a chance to be involved." My heart sank into my stomach as the full implications of what she was saying hit me. "Absolutely not," I said, struggling desperately to keep my voice steady despite the shock and anger I was feeling. "Victoria, he's manipulating you. Don't you remember? He abandoned you when you needed him most." Her reply was sharp, cold, and sounded almost rehearsed, as if she had practiced this conversation multiple times before making the call. "He's changed, Marcus. He wants to make things right between us, and he has some really good ideas for improving the business." The words sounded like they were coming directly from Robert's mouth rather than from Victoria's heart. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Robert had somehow managed to worm his way so deeply into Victoria's trust that she was now willing to hand over control of the company we had built together to a man who had contributed absolutely nothing to its success. The anger boiling inside me was almost overwhelming, but I knew I had to maintain my composure. "He's playing you, Victoria," I said as calmly as I could manage. "He doesn't deserve a single penny from what we built together over all these years." She scoffed bitterly, and her next words cut deeper than any physical blow could have. "We? It's always been yours, Marcus. You've just been waiting to hand it to me as some kind of reward for being the daughter you chose to raise." Robert opened my eyes to the truth. "It's always been your company, and you've been dangling it like a carrot, controlling me all along." My chest tightened with disbelief and profound hurt. "Victoria, that's Robert talking, not you. He's poisoning your mind against me. This business was always built for you, with your future in mind." "No," she shot back coldly, her words precise and deliberately cutting. "Robert deserves a chance and I'm giving it to him. End of story." Before I could respond, the line went dead, leaving me stunned and feeling completely hollow. I sat there staring at the phone, struggling to comprehend how thoroughly Robert had managed to turn Victoria against me. The betrayal felt deeper and more painful than anything I had ever experienced. "That's not fair," I finally managed to say into the empty room, my voice thick with emotion. "I've only ever wanted the best for you." When Diana found me sitting there in stunned silence, staring blankly into space, I explained what had just happened. She immediately broke down, crying softly into my shoulder as the reality of our situation became clear. We were losing Victoria piece by piece to a man who didn't deserve her loyalty, love, or trust. But what Robert clearly didn't understand, and what Victoria had apparently forgotten in her emotional turmoil, was that this wasn't some simple lemonade stand that could be casually transferred between family members. The company had comprehensive bylaws that required full board approval for any share transfers. This had always been the case. It was explicitly outlined in the shareholder agreement that Victoria herself had signed when I originally gifted her the equity in the company. She couldn't simply sell or assign control to anyone, let alone someone like Robert who had no legitimate connection to the business, without jumping through a complex legal minefield. The protections were built into the very foundation of the company specifically to prevent exactly this kind of hostile takeover attempt. The following day, Ryan showed up at our doorstep looking completely exhausted and emotionally defeated. He quietly admitted that Victoria had lashed out at him severely for daring to question the wisdom of the share transfer. Robert had apparently warned Ryan explicitly that opposing his involvement would mean seriously risking Ryan's marriage to Victoria. The threat was clear and calculated. Fall in line with Robert's plans or lose your wife. "I'll testify," Ryan said with surprising firmness, seeming to surprise even himself with his resolve. "He's manipulating her, and if she won't see it for herself, then I'll be the one to say it out loud in court if necessary." But then his voice dropped to a desperate whisper as the full weight of his impossible situation became clear. "I'm stuck, Marcus," he said, visibly shaken by the emotional toll this was taking on him. "If I fight too hard against this, she'll walk away from me. But if I say nothing and just go along with it, she'll end up destroying everything you've built." His desperation mirrored exactly what I was feeling, and I could see that Robert had carefully and methodically set up this scenario to make resistance feel impossible for everyone involved. Robert had strategically isolated each of us, making us all feel like we were fighting alone against his influence. He had created a situation where any attempt to protect Victoria or the business would be perceived as an attack on her happiness and her right to have a relationship with her biological father. But I knew that surrender wasn't an option, no matter how difficult the fight ahead might be. I had worked too hard and loved too deeply to simply let Robert waltz back into our lives and systematically dismantle everything we had built together. The family I had devoted my life to creating, and the business I had built specifically for Victoria's future were both worth fighting for, even if that meant going to war with the daughter I loved. That night, Diana and I made the difficult but necessary decision that it was time to fight back. We would approach this legally, strategically, and decisively. Robert might have managed to win the first few battles through manipulation and emotional blackmail, but we were determined to make sure he wouldn't win the overall war. The stakes were too high, and too much was at risk for us to simply give up without a real fight. We wasted no time the next morning in taking decisive action. I scheduled an urgent meeting with Kevin, our family attorney who had handled various legal matters for us over the years. Kevin was a no-nonsense guy with an excellent reputation for winning tough cases, and I knew we would need his expertise and experience to navigate what was clearly going to be a complex legal battle. Kevin listened carefully and attentively as I laid out the entire situation from beginning to end. I watched his expression gradually harden as the details of Robert's manipulation and threats unfolded. By the time I finished explaining everything that had transpired, Kevin was visibly angry on our behalf and ready to take immediate action. Kevin quickly began conducting a thorough investigation into Robert's background and recent activities. Within just a few days, he had uncovered Robert's sketchy and troubling history. The man had a long trail of failed businesses behind him, multiple instances of unpaid debts, and a consistent pattern of financial ruin that followed him wherever he went. But even more damaging was what Kevin discovered about Robert's recent activities. Kevin secured concrete evidence that Robert was already quietly approaching potential investors, making promises to them about control and influence in our company. Promises he had absolutely no right or authority to make. These weren't just casual conversations. Robert was actively misrepresenting his position and making commitments using equity and power that he didn't actually possess. Armed with this damaging information, Kevin advised me to begin documenting everything meticulously. He instructed me to keep detailed records of every interaction Robert had with anyone connected to the company, every conversation Victoria had about the shares, and any possible manipulation attempts we could identify. Having a clear, well-documented plan of action helped ease some of the anxiety I had been carrying about our situation. Kevin printed out one particularly incriminating email chain where Robert had literally written to a potential investor. "Once I'm in, I'll restructure operations completely. Our team is already in place and ready to take control." Kevin slid the printed emails across his desk to me with a grim expression. "He's promising equity he doesn't own, Marcus," Kevin said bluntly. "That's securities fraud. These investors can sue him, or worse, criminal charges could be filed." "That was all I needed to hear," I replied, feeling a sense of relief for the first time in weeks. This wasn't just emotional manipulation or family drama anymore. This was criminal stupidity on Robert's part, and he had left a clear paper trail of his illegal activities. But Robert wasn't finished playing his dangerous games with our family. He requested a private meeting with me, which I reluctantly agreed to attend. I wanted to keep things as civil as possible for Victoria's sake, even though I knew this conversation would likely be unpleasant and potentially threatening. We met at a local diner, and Robert immediately dropped any pretense of friendliness or civility. "Marcus," he began with transparently false politeness, "we both know this doesn't have to get ugly between us." "It already is ugly," I replied bluntly, refusing to play along with his games. Robert leaned forward across the table, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper that was clearly intended to intimidate me. "Look, fighting this publicly will only make you look bitter and controlling," he said with calculated malice. "Do you really want everyone thinking you're trying to deny Victoria her rightful inheritance? Because that's exactly how I'll spin this story." My jaw tightened as I stared back at him, refusing to be intimidated by his obvious threats. "Don't pretend you care about Victoria," I said firmly. "You've only ever cared about yourself, and everyone who knows the real story can see right through your act." Robert's smile turned icy cold, and his mask of false civility dropped completely. "You underestimate me, Marcus," he said with quiet menace. "I have no problem making sure everyone hears a very different version of this story. One where you're the controlling stepfather who's been holding Victoria back from her real family all these years." His threat hung in the air between us, clear and unmistakable. He was essentially promising to wage a public relations war against me, painting me as the villain in a story where he was somehow the wronged party. But I refused to back down or show any sign that his intimidation tactics were having their intended effect. I held his gaze steadily, my voice calm and unflinching. "You picked the wrong fight, Robert," I said with quiet confidence. "You're going to regret this decision." After that tense confrontation, I immediately brought Robert's latest threats to Kevin's attention. But my attorney shut down that particular concern the moment I mentioned it. "He has no standing whatsoever," Kevin said flatly, dismissing Robert's threats with professional certainty. "A man who hasn't seen his daughter in 2 decades doesn't suddenly get legal rights to a child he's never met. That's simply not how the law works, Marcus." His threats are completely empty. While I knew intellectually that Robert's legal threats were baseless, that didn't make them any less irritating or stressful to deal with. Kevin advised me that we needed to move quickly and decisively to shut down Robert's interference before he could cause any more damage to our family or business. We officially filed comprehensive legal documents contesting Victoria's claimed right to transfer her shares without proper board approval. Robert responded almost immediately with his own counterclaims, setting the stage for what would clearly be an intense and potentially lengthy legal battle. Meanwhile, Ryan continued to struggle deeply with the situation at home. Victoria was becoming increasingly volatile and unpredictable, lashing out at him whenever he dared to question Robert's motives or express any concerns about the direction their marriage was heading. One evening, Ryan showed up at our house again, looking visibly shaken and completely exhausted by the constant tension. Kevin told me bluntly that we couldn't afford to wait any longer, and for once I found myself in complete agreement with his assessment of our situation. Victoria is bound by the same shareholder agreement as everyone else in this company, Kevin reminded me with professional clarity. The agreement has a forced buyout clause specifically for breach of fiduciary duty, and she's violated it in at least 6 different ways through her actions with Robert. You're not firing your daughter, Marcus. You're simply enforcing a legally binding contract that she agreed to follow. Kevin closed the file he had been reviewing, folded his hands on the desk, and locked his eyes directly on mine. "I'm going to say this as plainly and directly as I can, Marcus," he said, his voice low but completely serious. "If you want to protect the business you've spent your life building, you have to remove Victoria from it now. Buy her out completely, freeze her shares permanently, and tighten the bylaws so this kind of situation can never happen again. Because if you don't take decisive action right now, Robert's going to keep bleeding you dry through her, and there won't be anything left to save." I didn't respond immediately to Kevin's harsh but realistic assessment. I just sat there staring at the papers spread across his desk. Profit and loss charts showing the company's recent struggles, documentation of project delays caused by Victoria's absence, records of shareholder tension, and contracts that Victoria had ignored or mishandled. I had built this company from absolutely nothing, brick by brick, day by day, working countless hours and making enormous sacrifices along the way. I had started this business specifically so that Victoria would never have to struggle financially the way Diana and I had during our early years together. Every decision I made, every risk I took, every late night I spent working was done with her future security and happiness in mind. And now I was sitting in my attorney's office being told that to save my life's work, I had to completely sever Victoria from it. Kevin leaned forward across the desk, his expression serious and uncompromising. "You're a smart man, Marcus, and you already know that what I'm saying is absolutely true," he continued. "You've given Victoria chance after chance to correct her behavior and make things right. She's not just emotionally unstable at this point. She's been completely compromised by Robert's influence. As long as she maintains ownership in the company, he effectively gets influence and control over our operations. He's already making promises about fake equity to outside investors, essentially gambling with your entire life's work." I took a deep breath and let it out slowly, feeling the weight of the decision I was about to make. My jaw was clenched so tightly it was actually causing me physical pain. "It'll destroy her," I said quietly, thinking about how devastating this would be for Victoria. "If I take everything away from her like this..." Kevin cut me off before I could continue down that path. "She already gave it away, Marcus," he said matter-of-factly. "You're just cleaning up the wreckage and protecting what's left." I sat back in my chair, swallowing hard against a bitter lump of emotion in my throat. Memories flooded through my mind. Victoria's first day shadowing me in the office when she was just 16 years old, asking intelligent questions about construction planning and project management. I remembered her drawing out a new warehouse layout on a napkin during lunch, treating it like it was the blueprint for her entire future. The pride I had felt watching her confidently step into boardrooms and command respect from seasoned professionals. The way I used to see my own ambition and drive reflected in her enthusiasm for the business. But I had to face the painful reality that the version of Victoria who had shared those dreams with me didn't exist anymore. I nodded slowly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do it. Draft all the necessary papers. Full buyout, immediate freeze on all her voting rights." Kevin gave a single, efficient nod, already reaching for a new folder. "It's the right move, Marcus. I'll have her served with the papers within 48 hours. The days that followed were filled with tense meetings and stressful planning sessions as we prepared for what was clearly going to be a complex legal battle. The procedures and paperwork wore on all of us emotionally, but especially Diana, who was watching her family fall apart piece by piece. She did her best to maintain a brave face and supportive demeanor, but I could see the enormous toll the situation was taking on her mental and emotional well-being. We held on to each other tightly during this difficult period, finding comfort and strength in our shared determination to protect what we had built together. Then came the moment I had been dreading. Victoria barged into my office without any warning or announcement. She was gripping the legal envelope that Kevin had sent her that morning, and it was obvious that she had ripped it open right there in the driveway. The envelope flap was completely shredded, and the pages inside were bent and wrinkled, as if she had been squeezing them tightly during her entire drive to the office. "You're buying me out," she snapped at me, skipping any pretense of normal greetings or casual conversation. She went straight to the explosive confrontation that had clearly been building up inside her since she received the legal documents. I didn't flinch or react defensively to her aggressive tone. I remained seated in my chair, kept my hands folded calmly, and maintained a steady voice despite the emotional storm brewing in the room. "I offered you a clean exit," I replied evenly. "One that protects the business we built together, one that gives you genuine financial security, and one that allows you to save face publicly." She scoffed dismissively at my explanation. "Protect the business? You're just protecting yourself. You want me completely out of your life." "No, Victoria," I said, my tone remaining calm but turning noticeably colder. "I want Robert out of my business permanently. And if that means separating you from it as well, then so be it. He's been using you like a Trojan horse to get inside our operations, and I'm not going to let him through my gates." She took a step closer to my desk, practically shaking with rage and indignation. "I'm not your enemy, Marcus," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "Then stop acting like one," I shot back firmly. "You brought him into confidential board discussions. You leaked our private investor contact information to him. You gave him unauthorized access to internal company documents. And you offered him decision-making power in a company he never lifted a finger to build. That's not naivety anymore, Victoria. That's deliberate sabotage." She looked genuinely stunned by my direct accusations, clearly hurt, but notably not apologetic about any of her actions. The remorse and understanding that I had hoped to see in her eyes was simply gone, replaced by a stubborn defensiveness. "I trusted him," she whispered, as if that somehow justified everything she had done. "He's my dad. And I'm the man who actually raised you," I said, finally standing up from my chair to face her directly. "I'm the one who paid for your braces when you were self-conscious about your smile. I'm the one who drove across town to attend your middle school play in the middle of a work crisis because it mattered to you. I'm the one who taught you construction bottom lines, payroll cycles, and project management. And you threw all of that away for a man who called you once and bought you coffee." She blinked rapidly, as if she was either forcing back tears or fighting desperately to hold on to the distorted narrative that Robert had fed her about our family dynamics. "You always made me feel like I had to earn everything from you," she said accusingly. "Like I constantly had to prove I was good enough for what you built." "You never had to prove anything to me, Victoria," I replied with complete sincerity. "You just had to respect what we built together. Respect me, respect this family, respect the sacrifices we all made. Instead, you brought a snake back into this house and handed him the keys to everything we worked for." She paused for a moment, and something flickered across her face. Perhaps a brief moment of uncertainty or recognition of the truth in my words. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "I'm not signing anything," she declared defiantly. I nodded, having anticipated this response. "I figured as much." She straightened her posture, clearly preparing to deliver what she thought would be her winning argument. "Robert says I have a legal right to those shares. He's talked to people, consulted with lawyers. He's not just winging this. He has a real plan." I actually laughed at the absurdity of her statement. "Robert can talk to all the lawyers he wants, Victoria. I've got Kevin, and what you're apparently forgetting is that being technically right on paper doesn't make you morally right as a person." She stepped back slightly, as if my words had physically slapped her. But I was completely done dancing around the harsh realities of this situation. "You had a choice," I said, my voice becoming harder and more direct. "I offered you a way out of this mess, a dignified solution that would have protected everyone involved. But you're too far under his spell to see what's really happening here. So now the gloves have come off." "I'll fight you," she whispered, but her voice lacked the conviction she was trying to project. I nodded calmly. "Then I guess I'll see you in court." She stood there for another few seconds, as if waiting for me to take back everything I had said, to soften my position and return to being the accommodating father figure she was used to dealing with. But I didn't budge. That version of me, the man who had built his entire world around her happiness and success, the one who would have given her everything without hesitation or conditions, was gone. She had buried him the day she chose to let Robert into our boardroom and our family's private business. She turned and left my office without another word, and I let her go. Diana appeared around the corner a minute later, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She had clearly heard most of our confrontation. "Did you mean every word of what you just said?" she asked me quietly. "Every single word," I replied without hesitation. As the court date approached, Robert's threats and intimidation tactics intensified dramatically. He tried desperately to sway public opinion in his favor, spreading whispers and rumors throughout our professional community about me being jealous, controlling, and unreasonably possessive of a business that should rightfully belong to Victoria. But Kevin remained completely unfazed by these amateur attempts at character assassination, steadily and methodically preparing our case with the precision and clarity that comes from years of legal experience. When the day finally arrived for our court hearing, Diana squeezed my hand tightly as we walked into the courthouse together. Without saying a word, she was silently promising that we would face whatever came next as a united front, just as we had faced every other challenge in our marriage. Across the courtroom, Robert sat smugly and confidently, clearly believing that his manipulation and charm would carry the day. But I knew we were thoroughly prepared and ready for this fight. This legal battle wasn't just about protecting our business from a hostile takeover attempt. It was about defending our family, our values, and everything we had worked so hard to build together over the years. I was fully prepared to do whatever it took to win. The courtroom atmosphere felt cold and impersonal as Diana and I took our designated seats. Kevin sat beside us, calmly organizing his extensive notes and legal documents with the methodical precision of someone who had been through this process countless times before. Across the aisle from us, Robert exuded a false confidence that was almost nauseating to witness. He leaned back casually in his chair, occasionally whispering to Victoria, and clearly believing that his charm and manipulation would somehow carry the day. Victoria herself looked visibly anxious and uncomfortable, deliberately avoiding making eye contact with Diana and me. I could see that she was torn between loyalty to Robert and the growing confusion she must have been feeling about the situation she had created. Ryan sat behind her, physically present but emotionally isolated, and obviously troubled by everything that was happening to his family. When the judge entered the courtroom, everyone stood briefly in respect, before settling back into their seats for what would prove to be a decisive confrontation. Kevin began his presentation with the methodical, professional approach that had made him so successful over the years. He carefully outlined every single detail of Robert's deceptive attempts to infiltrate and take control of our company, his unauthorized promises to outside investors, and his systematic manipulation of Victoria's emotions and decision-making process. Each point Kevin made was reinforced by carefully documented proof that left no room for doubt or alternative interpretation. He presented emails showing Robert's promises to investors, recorded conversations that revealed his true intentions, and detailed financial records that demonstrated the damage his interference had already caused to our business operations. Kevin's presentation was precise, unwavering, and devastating to Robert's position. Robert's attorney attempted to paint me as a controlling and possessive stepfather, claiming that Robert was simply trying to reconnect with his estranged daughter and legitimately invest in a family business. But Kevin swiftly and effectively countered every one of these arguments, presenting clear evidence of Robert's threats, intimidation tactics, and manipulative behavior. He also called Ryan to testify about Robert's pressure tactics and the devastating impact they were having on his marriage to Victoria. Kevin mentioned almost casually that several of Robert's potential investors had quietly pulled out of their planned investments after learning more about the situation. Some were even considering legal action against Robert for his false promises and misrepresented positions within our company. While Robert might not end up going to jail for his actions, his reputation in the business community was clearly circling the drain rapidly. Throughout the entire hearing, I kept glancing over at Victoria, watching the pain and confusion that was clearly written across her face. Part of me genuinely wished that we weren't in this courtroom at all, that we could have resolved this situation privately as a family without involving lawyers and judges. But Robert had systematically forced our hand by making this kind of legal confrontation inevitable through his aggressive and illegal behavior. When it was finally Robert's turn to speak on his own behalf, he was initially smooth and well-rehearsed in his presentation. He painted himself as a misunderstood father figure who was simply trying to support his daughter's future success and happiness. He emphasized his claimed desire to make amends for past mistakes and to contribute positively to Victoria's life going forward. But when Kevin began his cross-examination, Robert's carefully constructed facade started to crumble rapidly. He stumbled over obvious inconsistencies in his story, growing increasingly defensive and agitated under Kevin's methodical scrutiny. His temper began to surface as Kevin pressed him on specific details, and his responses became sharp, aggressive, and revealing of the true nature that lay behind his charming public persona. Victoria watched in growing disbelief as Robert's carefully crafted image shattered publicly before her eyes. I could see the shock and dawning realization on her face as she finally witnessed firsthand the kind of man Robert really was underneath all his manipulation and false promises. Ryan reached out gently, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder, but she shrugged it off, still too overwhelmed to accept comfort from anyone. The courtroom maintained its sterile and impersonal atmosphere throughout the proceedings, feeling like it hadn't witnessed real human drama in years. Diana sat next to me with her fingers laced through mine so tightly that it felt like she was physically anchoring me to the floor, keeping me grounded during this emotionally turbulent experience. Kevin maintained his characteristic calm demeanor, methodically flipping through his carefully tabbed binder as if he was preparing for a routine business inspection rather than waging a legal war that would determine our family's future. "We're not here today because of a simple mistake or misunderstanding," Kevin stated clearly to the judge. "We're here because my client extended every possible opportunity for reasonable resolution of this conflict, and he was met with hostility, manipulation, and a blatant attempt to seize control of a private company under completely false pretenses." Kevin slid a thick manila folder across to the judge's desk with professional confidence. Included in this documentation is the formal buyout offer that was extended to Miss Victoria, an offer that was generous, legally sound, and properly documented well before this court date was even scheduled. It was rejected not with a counteroffer or good faith negotiation, but with flat refusal, backed by threats of litigation, if we didn't voluntarily hand over partial control to Mr. Robert, a man with no legal ties to the company and no professional experience that would qualify him for any decision-making authority. The judge raised an eyebrow with obvious interest as he flipped through the comprehensive documents. "This buyout offer was sent prior to filing these legal proceedings?" he asked for clarification. "Yes, Your Honor. It was sent on October 15th and was declined that same day," Kevin confirmed. Kevin then systematically laid out the complete digital trail of Robert's unauthorized contact with outside investors, including emails where he had explicitly referred to our business operations with Victoria, copied on the correspondence. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. Then came Ryan's testimony, which was quiet and reluctant but absolutely devastating to Robert's position. I had told Ryan beforehand that he didn't have to speak publicly if he wasn't comfortable doing so, that Diana and I would completely understand if he chose to stay out of the legal proceedings. But Ryan had shaken his head firmly and said, "If I stay quiet, I'm essentially letting that man win. I love Victoria deeply, but I'm not going to lie for her father. Not after everything he's done to our family. Robert threatened to ruin my marriage," Ryan testified, his voice shaking with emotion but his resolve unmistakable. "He told me explicitly that if I didn't support his involvement in the business, Victoria would see me as the reason her father was being locked out of her life. He coached her on what to say during arguments. She started quoting legal terms that she didn't even understand. It was like she wasn't thinking for herself anymore. She was just repeating his words." Robert's attorney attempted to characterize the buyout offer as a coercive move designed to disinherit a rightful successor from her family business. But Kevin fired back immediately with devastating effectiveness. "Miss Victoria was already a full shareholder in this company," Kevin stated firmly. "She wasn't being removed arbitrarily or vindictively. She was offered a clean, dignified exit because her recent behavior had seriously compromised the company's operational stability and financial security. My client wasn't severing ties with a daughter. He was protecting a legitimate business from someone who was actively working with an unauthorized outsider to undermine its foundation." Then it was Robert's turn to testify on his own behalf, and this was the moment I had been anticipating with a mixture of dread and satisfaction. Robert walked to the witness stand like he was being presented with some kind of award, displaying the same confident, arrogant demeanor that had characterized all of his interactions with our family. He even had the audacity to wink at Victoria as he passed her seat. Robert initially tried to deploy his well-practiced charm offensive, speaking eloquently about reconnecting with his estranged family and emphasizing how he saw this as a genuine chance to be part of something meaningful and positive in Victoria's life. He claimed that he had simply been trying to guide Victoria through some innovative ideas for modernizing the company's operations. Kevin allowed Robert to talk extensively, giving him plenty of rope with which to hang himself. Then Kevin stood up and systematically went for Robert's throat with surgical precision. "You say you only wanted to help Victoria with the business?" Kevin asked with deceptive casualness. "Yes, that's correct," Robert replied confidently. "You never asked for any money or financial compensation?" "No, I did not." "You never tried to influence the ownership structure or decision-making processes?" "Absolutely not," Robert lied smoothly. Kevin smiled slightly and reached into his file folder, pulling out a printed transcript that would prove to be Robert's downfall. This audio recording was captured during a documented phone call between Mr. Robert and one of the investors he approached without any board approval, Kevin said, sliding the transcript to the judge while simultaneously pressing play on an audio device. Robert's own voice came through the courtroom speakers, relaxed and arrogantly confident. "Look, the buyout offer is completely meaningless. I've got Victoria on board with my plans. She'll vote exactly how I tell her to vote. We're already planning our next steps for taking control. This guy Marcus can't stop us." Robert visibly flinched as his own words condemned him. The courtroom fell into complete stunned silence. Kevin let the damaging audio hang in the air for a full 5 seconds before continuing his devastating cross-examination. "Is that still your position, Mr. Robert?" Kevin asked, folding his hands calmly. Robert's face tightened with obvious panic. "That conversation was taken completely out of context," he stammered. "It's your voice, isn't it?" Kevin pressed relentlessly. "I was frustrated and speaking carelessly," Robert tried to explain. Kevin leaned in for the kill. "You were arrogant and manipulative. You saw an opportunity to walk into something you didn't build and take a piece of it because you thought no one would have the courage to stop you." That's when Robert completely cracked under the pressure. His carefully maintained composure shattered, the charm disappeared entirely, and his true nature was revealed for everyone in the courtroom to see. "You think this guy deserves it all?" Robert snapped angrily, gesturing toward me with obvious contempt. "She's my kid, my blood. I have a right to be involved in her life. He's just a stand-in, a fill-in-the-gap stepdad with a superiority complex." The judge leaned forward sternly. "That's enough, Mr. Robert." When the judge returned to the courtroom after a brief recess to consider all the evidence presented, his tone was sharp, decisive, and completely final in its judgment. The court finds that Miss Victoria cannot transfer or assign her shares in this company without explicit board approval, as clearly outlined in the shareholder agreement she voluntarily signed, the judge stated with authority. Furthermore, Mr. Robert has absolutely no legal standing in this company, either legally or professionally. His involvement in these matters constitutes a clear and deliberate attempt to interfere in the legitimate governance of a private business entity. The judge continued with evident disapproval. "The evidence presented to this court demonstrates a clear and troubling pattern of manipulation, coercion, and deliberate misrepresentation on Mr. Roberts' part. Mr. Harper's claims are hereby dismissed permanently, and he is enjoined from any further interference in the operations of this business." The gavel came down with a resounding bang, and that was it. The legal battle was over decisively in our favor. The bailiff moved in quickly and efficiently to escort Robert out of the courtroom, but even as he was being removed, he continued muttering bitter curses and threats under his breath. As we stood to leave the courtroom, Robert's composure completely exploded in a final display of rage and vindictiveness. He confronted Victoria openly and publicly, his angry voice echoing through the courthouse corridors for everyone present to hear. "This is your fault, Victoria," he shouted with vicious intensity. "You promised me control over that company, and now look at this complete mess you've created. You're worthless." His harsh, cruel words reverberated through the courtroom, finally and completely shattering any remaining illusions Victoria might have had about his true character and motivations. The mask had fallen away entirely, revealing the selfish, manipulative person he had always been underneath his carefully constructed facade. Victoria stood frozen in place, tears streaming down her face as the full reality of Robert's betrayal hit her like a physical blow. Ryan immediately stepped protectively between her and Robert, gently but firmly guiding her away from the confrontation while trying to shield her from further emotional damage. Robert stormed out of the courthouse, his angry threats and bitter recriminations still lingering in the air long after he had disappeared from view. I felt absolutely no satisfaction or triumph in his defeat, only profound sorrow for all the damage he had managed to cause to our family relationships during his brief but destructive return to our lives. The courthouse fell into shocked silence as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. Victoria stared after Robert with wide, disbelieving eyes, visibly shaken by his cruel and vicious outburst. Her voice came out faint and wounded when she finally managed to speak. "Robert, what are you saying?" she called out desperately, but he was already gone. We had barely stepped outside the courthouse building when Robert stormed directly toward us, his face completely contorted with bitter rage and vindictive anger. He didn't hesitate for even a moment before unleashing a final, devastating verbal assault on Victoria, speaking loud enough for all the gathered onlookers and court personnel to hear every cruel word. "You're worthless, Victoria," he shouted with pure venom. "I wasted months of my time pretending to care about you, and for what? You couldn't even deliver your end of our deal. I deserved much better than a weak, gullible daughter like you. You're absolutely pathetic." Victoria recoiled as though she had been physically struck, staggering backward as she shook her head desperately in denial. Her eyes filled rapidly with tears, and her voice cracked with raw anguish as she tried to process this final betrayal. "Stop it, Robert! Stop lying to me!" she cried out in desperation. "You said you loved me! I gave you everything I had!" Robert sneered openly, laughing cruelly at her obvious distress and emotional pain. "Loved you? I barely knew you when I left. And from what I've seen since I came back, you're not worth knowing now. You're just as pathetic and disappointing now as you were when I left you the first time." At those devastating words, Victoria completely unraveled emotionally. She lunged forward with tears streaming uncontrollably down her face, her voice rising to a frantic, shattered scream that echoed painfully through the courthouse courtyard. "You're a monster! How could you do this to me? You promised me everything. You lied about everything. You ruined my entire life." She crumbled to her knees, sobbing violently with heart-wrenching cries that were painful to witness. Ryan immediately rushed to kneel beside her, pulling her gently but protectively into his arms while trying to comfort her. "Victoria, please, it's over now," Ryan said softly. "He's not worth your tears. He never was." Robert stepped back with cold, complete indifference, disgust clearly written across his face as he watched Victoria's emotional breakdown with no trace of remorse or compassion. "Good luck picking up those pieces," he spat dismissively before turning and striding away without a single backward glance. I stood there feeling frozen in place, my fists clenched tightly, breathing heavily as I watched this final, brutal confrontation unfold. Diana clung to my arm, trembling with shock at the cruelty we had just witnessed. We watched helplessly as Victoria experienced her complete emotional breakdown, finally seeing the horrifying truth about the man she had chosen over the family who had always been there for her unconditionally. After witnessing Robert's cruel and devastating final outburst, Victoria slowly approached Diana and me with an expression that was completely broken and filled with genuine remorse. Her face was streaked with tears, and her entire demeanor had changed dramatically from the defensive, angry woman who had confronted me in my office just weeks earlier. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion and barely audible above the courthouse noise around us. "I didn't realize what was happening. I didn't see who he really was." I looked at her with a heart that was heavy with profound sadness and disappointment. "We tried to warn you, Victoria," I said quietly. "We wanted to protect you from exactly this kind of pain." She nodded weakly, tears falling freely as the full weight of her mistakes became clear to her. Diana immediately embraced her softly, whispering comforting words and maternal reassurances despite everything that had happened between us. I stepped back slightly, giving them space to have their moment while feeling both relief that the truth had finally been revealed and profound sorrow about the fractures that had been created within our family. This legal victory felt completely hollow and empty, overshadowed by the deep emotional damage that Robert had managed to inflict on all of our relationships. The court had ruled in our favor, but the personal cost had been enormous for everyone involved. In the weeks that followed the trial, Robert completely disappeared from our lives, leaving behind nothing but a trail of unpaid debts, broken promises, and shattered trust. Victoria began attending counseling sessions to help her process the emotional trauma and manipulation she had experienced, and she started working seriously to repair the significant damage that had been done to her marriage and her relationships with our family. Ryan stood by her side throughout this difficult healing process, demonstrating remarkable patience and support as he helped her rebuild her sense of self-worth and judgment. He remained determined to reconstruct their life together, despite everything they had been through. Our construction business slowly began to stabilize as it became free from Robert's interference and manipulation. However, the emotional scars from this entire ordeal remained deep and painful for all of us. Trust had been fundamentally damaged, relationships had been severely strained, and Diana and I found ourselves leaning heavily on each other for emotional support, drawing strength from the unshakable bond we had built over years of marriage. One evening, several weeks after the trial, Victoria came by our house looking nervous but clearly resolved to have an important conversation. We talked openly and honestly for the first time since everything had begun to unravel months earlier. She acknowledged the serious hurt she had caused through her actions and decisions, accepting full responsibility for the damage she had done to our family relationships. "I can't change what happened or undo the mistakes I made," she admitted softly, her voice filled with genuine regret. "But I want to try to rebuild our relationship, if you'll let me." She looked up at me directly, her eyes still bloodshot from crying but filled with sincere remorse. "I let him use me as a weapon against you," she said. "I didn't see what was happening until it was too late. I lost my place in the company, I nearly destroyed my marriage, and I don't even know if I deserve to be sitting here asking for forgiveness." "You don't," I said evenly, my tone firm and uncompromising. I looked directly at Victoria, making absolutely sure there was no room for misunderstanding or false hope in what I was about to say. My tone remained firm and completely uncompromising throughout this conversation. "You can come here occasionally, and you can visit with your mother," I continued. "You'll be treated with basic respect and courtesy. But don't mistake that for reconciliation or forgiveness." She stared at me uncertainly, not quite sure what she was hearing or how to process my words. I didn't build my entire life around raising someone else's child just to be told that none of it mattered when her real father showed up, I said with absolute clarity. "You gave everything we built together to a man who vanished the second that life got difficult. And then you defended him while he tried to steal everything I had worked to protect. That wasn't just a mistake, Victoria. That was a fundamental betrayal of everything our family stood for." Victoria sobbed quietly, burying her head in her hands as the full weight of my words sank in. Diana sat beside her silently, gently rubbing her back while tears formed in her own eyes. I allowed them to have their emotional moment, but when Victoria finally looked at me again, I spoke with complete clarity about our future relationship. "The only reason we'll still share a room now and then is because of your mother," I explained. "For her sake, I'll be civil and polite when you're here. For her sake, I'll treat you with basic human decency. But don't expect anything more from me than that. I'm completely done pretending this is something it's not." Victoria opened her mouth slightly as if she was about to speak, then closed it again, finally realizing the full weight and permanence of what I had just laid out for her. Her eyes filled with tears, but I held her gaze steadily, refusing to soften my stance or offer false hope. She nodded slowly, tears glistening in her eyes but not falling. There were no further objections, no desperate pleas for reconsideration. Victoria had finally understood the severity of what she had lost and, more importantly, why she had lost it permanently. In the months that followed our difficult conversation, life slowly moved forward, but it never returned to what it had once been. The fundamental nature of our family relationships had been permanently altered by everything that had happened. Family dinners resumed on a regular basis, though they were notably quieter and more subdued than they had been in the past. Our conversations were marked by careful consideration and guarded interactions, with all of us being much more cautious about what we said and how we said it. Victoria visited our home often enough to maintain a relationship with Diana and to ensure that her son could know his grandparents. However, our conversations remained focused on safe, neutral topics, discussions about the weather, movies we had seen, updates about the baby's development, and other surface-level subjects. We never again spoke about the business, the legal battle, or the deep emotional wounds that Robert had inflicted on our family. Those topics remained completely off-limits by unspoken agreement. Laughter still occurred occasionally during our family gatherings, but it was notably more cautious and restrained than it had been before. There was a constant awareness of the lines that had been drawn and the trust that had been fundamentally altered. The easy warmth and unconditional affection that had once characterized our relationship was permanently diminished, replaced by something more formal and distant. Ryan continued to make genuine attempts to bridge the gap between Victoria and the rest of the family, but he eventually came to accept the new reality of our situation. He understood where I stood on these matters and respected the boundaries I had established without question or argument. He had witnessed firsthand the damage that Robert had caused, and he knew that some things simply couldn't be repaired or returned to their original state. Victoria herself seemed quietly resigned to the fundamental changes in our relationship. She appeared to understand that our bond had been permanently altered, and that the easy, trusting father-daughter relationship we had once shared was gone forever. We still showed up for each other when it truly mattered. Important family events, medical emergencies, and other significant occasions. But the deep emotional connection that had once defined our relationship was notably absent. It became our new normal, a relationship that was colder and more distant than before, but at least it was honest and authentic. We all understood exactly where we stood with each other, and there were no false pretenses or unrealistic expectations about returning to the way things used to be. The scars left by Robert's poison ran incredibly deep, serving as a constant reminder of the choices Victoria had made and the man I had been forced to become in response to her betrayal. The trust that had been broken couldn't be rebuilt, and the hurt that had been caused couldn't be completely healed. We had all learned painful lessons about loyalty, family, and the consequences of allowing toxic people to infiltrate and destroy the relationships that matter most. This was the reality we now lived with. A family that had survived a devastating crisis but had been fundamentally changed by the experience. The love might still exist somewhere beneath the surface, but it was now tempered by caution, disappointment, and the knowledge that some betrayals create permanent changes that can never be fully undone. If you made it this far, thank you for reading my story. I know it's a difficult and painful narrative, but I felt it was important to share what happened to our family. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who can hurt us deepest. And sometimes protecting what you've built means making incredibly hard choices that change everything forever. I don't regret the decisions I made, even though they came at an enormous personal cost. Some boundaries, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. Some trust, once broken, can never be fully repaired. And sometimes the only way to protect what matters most is to accept that some relationships will never be the same again. Take care of the people who have been there for you from the beginning. They're the ones who matter most. She threatened to leave me if I don't support her relationship with Robert. Ryan confessed quietly, his eyes filled with genuine despair and fear. I'm losing her, Marcus. I don't know how to fight this without destroying my marriage in the process. Seeing Ryan's obvious distress and emotional pain only strengthened my resolve to put an end to Robert's manipulation once and for all. Robert's toxic influence wasn't just threatening our business and our family relationships. It was actively tearing apart the marriage of two people I genuinely cared about. I promised Ryan that we would do everything in our power to protect both him and Victoria from any further emotional harm. It was time to draw a clear line in the sand, not just in the courtroom, but in our personal lives as well.